Minette President of the National Farmers Union. I had the pleasure of speaking at their conference recently in Birmingham. Ben Bradshaw is with us as a farming link here because he was Secretary of State at DEFRA and indeed the DCMS in the, was it Gordon Brown government or Blair government, or both?
I was a junior minister in DEFRA, Ian, but I was a Cabinet Minister for Culture.
Right, I knew I'd get that wrong. And Charlotte Proudman is a regular on the programme. She's a human rights barrister at Goldsmiths Chambers, specialising in violence against women and girls. And Mike Parry is here too, the broadcaster and commentator. We're going to have a lively discussion over the next hour, depending on what you ask, I guess. The number is 0345 6060 973. And remember, you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Our first question comes from Michael in Muswell Hill. Michael, far away.
Oh, hi, Ian. My question is, why should Boris go to Ukraine, a war zone, when the benefits are negligible, as Ukraine and Putin already knows we support them, and yet the risk of him going there, being killed by a stray bomb, and us ending up at war with Russia is immense.
Mike Parry.
Well, I think Boris has had a very good war up until a couple of days ago when he made the analogy between Brexit and Ukraine, obviously. And I think he wants to keep the momentum going. And when a politician's in the mood that, I'm winning, I think he's got to find another trick, if you like, if you see what I mean, or keep himself in all the polls show that he's having a good Ukraine, so he wants to keep it up with the public. I don't believe he would go in any circumstances that would put him in danger, because that would be stupid and foolish.
Well, it is a war zone.
It is a war zone, I know, but what I'm saying is there are ways of going to these places and ways not. I was telling my colleagues just before the show, Ian, when I used to work in Northern Ireland, the only time you knew Mrs Thatcher was in town was when suddenly all the roads got shut off and the blue lights flashing in the convoy came into town. You never got a moment's notice or warning she was coming. And I think that's the best way for a Prime Minister like Boris Johnson to have done it. So I think this might just be, raising the temperature a bit in the popularity stakes.
Ben Bradshaw.
I mean, I think we should all be taking our lead from the government of Ukraine and President Zelensky. I mean, if President Zelensky wants Boris Johnson to go, then I think it should be seriously considered. But I suspect that President Zelensky would have, other high-profile priority visits. For instance, President Biden or the head of NATO.
That is never going to happen.
It's not going to happen at the moment. It's not going to happen at the moment, in all likelihood. But if we're heading to what seems like now a kind of war of attrition, with Putin just carpet bombing towns and civilian areas, reducing them to rubble, but not really making very much progress on the ground. You could be looking at a frozen conflict scenario as Putin achieved in Georgia, and the circumstances then might be, if there's talk of some kind of agreement or talks, that I think it would be quite important for senior Western leaders to go. I'm not sure that Boris Johnson going on his own is going to be sending exactly the right message. I think it should be a NATO. I mean, of course, the leaders of Czechoslovakia, Poland and Slovenia have already been. The Czech Republic, I do beg your pardon, have already been. And I think that gave a big boost to the morale of the of the Ukrainians. But as I say, I think the lead should come from the Ukrainians. And we tend to get rather kind of an over-exaggerated sense of our own importance in Britain, I'm afraid to say. This is a kind of a long-standing weakness that we have. We think we're a lot more important and powerful, and people care more about us than they really do. And in this conflict, it's NATO they care about, and America, and the European Union.
I'm not so sure that's right, actually. I mean, if you look at the reaction of Ukrainians to what Britain has contributed to this, they're
very grateful.
So far.
They're incredibly grateful for the arms.
I think if they draw a comparison between other countries which should remain nameless, and it's a pretty positive comparison.
On the arms, definitely. I think there's been frustration at how slow we've been on sanctioning individuals, and we've still got a lot of catching up on that. We're still behind America and Europe on sanctioning individuals, and of course on refugees we've been absolutely dreadful, and we're still dreadful, and that is shameful, I think.
Well, that might come up a little bit later. Charlotte.
So I think that Michael's absolutely right. I think that the risks are huge.
Being very formal, he likes to be known as Minette.
I think the risks are massive. I mean, how can they
Or are you
not
talking
be?
about the question?
I'm talking about the question.
I thought you were talking about mine.
No, we're just warming up.
The other Michael.
No, I think that, of course, the risks are going to be massive. I mean, you've got a head of state flying into a war zone. And how much is it going to cost to try
Hang on.
and keep...
You're suggesting the
Boris-
Queen might be going. He's not the head of state.
No, well, it's the Prime Minister, he's in charge of the country. And how much is that going to cost to make sure that he is kept safe in terms of his security, private jet, and so forth? And actually, couldn't that money be better utilised on, a greater effort to allow refugees to come to this country and to provide for them in terms of making sure they have public recourse to public funds. And at the moment, we're just not doing enough when it comes to refugees. I think the money could be better spent in that way. I understand the idea is that to show symbolic support for Ukraine, but as you said, we've done a great deal for Ukraine already. And I think a huge amount of money that's going to cost, I think, could be better utilised elsewhere.
Minette Batters.
I think
I challenge you to bring in a farming angle to this.
that might be beyond me. I think in line with what Mike says, I mean, I would say that there are probably plenty who are absolutely determined that he doesn't go, which is why the story has broken in advance. I can't believe that you would broadcast a Prime Minister going into a war zone if it was actually going to happen.
I mean, Ben, thinking back to your time in government, Gordon Brown used to pay the odd visit to Afghanistan and Iraq, I think. We only ever found out about those visits after he'd taken off and was on his way back, didn't we?
Yeah, and that was to visit British troops on the ground.
I'm not criticising. I mean, that's exactly how it ought to be.
Absolutely. And I think I'm right in saying that the visit of the three Central European leaders was also not pre-announced. It was made public on the day. So, I don't know where this suggestion or story has come from, but I just think let's just calm down and take our lead from what the Ukrainian government and President Zelensky want and ask for. And I'm sure that they have done. They've done not only such a good job and brave and courageous job at defending their country, they have done an amazing PR job as well. And they seem to know exactly what is needed when. And although, yes, they're frustrated that we haven't done more in terms of a no-fly zone, they are really doing a good communications operation. And if they felt it was helpful to have a visit, I suspect it wouldn't be Boris Johnson that they would want. But let's
I think they would actually, because I think one of the reasons he might be considering going is because he is very popular there. Okay, Macron has chosen to try and bring influence to bear on the other side with Putin. So why can't Boris, if he wants to, seize the initiative and say, look, I can rise right to the top here in terms of popularity, in terms of leadership, I might go and then cement my role here as the leader of the European bloc against Putin.
What would be interesting is if he went to Moscow, actually,
yes,
and saw Putin. Because Macron, I mean, I don't think you can criticise Macron for trying.
No.
But, I mean, I don't think he's emerged from it particularly brilliantly.
Totally agree.
Especially as he's got elections.
Electioneering, yeah.
Well, I think it's important that you have a back channel or some sort of channel to the Kremlin. And in terms of what France has done, they've been completely... they've been ahead of us on sanctioning individuals. They're supplying a lot of weapons. I think the fact that I think there's a slight sense in this country, particularly in the conservative government supporting media, that of I think envy of the access that Macron has. These long conversations with Putin. I mean,
really?
I feel quite sorry for him spending 2 hours on the phone to Putin, not achieving anything, but at least he's doing it, and it hasn't made any difference in terms of the conflict or what France has done. France has been completely on board with the EU and NATO, very hard line since this conflict started, and as I say, ahead of us on refugees and ahead of us on sanctions.
Right, let's go to another question. It's Steve in Southend. Steve, very good evening. What would you like to ask?
Good evening. Why have the UK government been so slow to take in Ukrainian refugees?
Charlotte.
Well, Priti Patel says that one of the reasons is because of security risks apparently posed by, people who could be pretending to be Ukrainians and, actually Russians, or those that are Russian sympathisers that could pose this national security risk apparently. So we need to be very cautious. But supposedly the same approach hasn't been taken in Romania or in Poland or in other countries where they've allowed millions of Ukrainian people who are displaced to seek refugee status in those countries.
I suppose she would then argue that Romania, Poland and other countries, they haven't been under the kind of attack that we have in this country from Russia in the past, so that they're less of a, it's less likely to happen there. I mean, I'm just playing devil's advocate.
I think,
I kind of agree with you.
Look, I'm not saying that there isn't a national security risk, and of course these things need to be evaluated, but why is it taking so long? If these checks do need to be carried out, of course they do. Why is it taking over a month to carry them out? Why are we still in a similar position that we were in at day one? And from what I read, it's only around just under 10,000 Ukrainians that have been granted UK visas to come to this country and stay with family members, or they have family membership relationships here. But what about all the other Ukrainians that don't have family members in this country? And what about the fact that over 150,000 British people have signed up to help refugees, to even house them in their own homes? That's the kind of compassion that British people have.
Well, they have
for
opened
refugees.
this sponsorship scheme now, haven't they? So, I mean, I don't quite understand, and maybe, Ben, you know more about this, but I don't understand how people are going to be matched. So you've got all of the people filling in the forms on the website now. You've got British people also filling in forms on a website, volunteering. But it seems at the moment as never the twain shall meet.
And I think you have to remember as well that refugees, and I represent asylum seekers in the immigration tribunal, they often come with a huge amount of trauma. Some of them have seen some horrendous things, and women, children that have been caught up in that kind of conflict. Some of them who are victims of sexual violence and other forms of trauma. And so I think, obviously it's extremely gracious of British people to welcome them into their home, but the British government should be prioritising Ukrainian refugees. We have a moral obligation, and under the Geneva Convention, we should be housing refugees in this country.
Prioritising them over other refugees?
No, I'm not suggesting that for any stretch of the imagination. Of course, all refugees, I think, should have equal opportunity to come to this country. But at the moment, we're seeing a Ukrainian war and millions of people that have been displaced, and we have an obligation to make sure they're in this country. But of course, there are other refugees that are coming from Ukraine, of people of colour that haven't even had a look-in when it comes to gaining refugee status, and that's not only in this country but also in European borders as well.
Minette, what can your members do to help this situation?
Iain, I
all
represent
these massive farmhouses.
Desperate for labour.
Absolutely.
Look, I represent, I guess, sort of nearly 50,000 farmers and growers across England and Wales, and I have been...
Including me.
Including you, very important. But I've been inundated with calls from farmers who really want to help, who want to house people, who want to do everything that they can. And they're infuriated that it is so slow, so bureaucratic. I mean, we left, this bureaucratic trading bloc, and here are we, the one country with all the red tape surrounding us that is making it more difficult to people to get here. So you've had a really clear signal from the British public. They want to help. Certainly the members that I represent, the farmers, they really want to help. And we just need to make it happen. But it is so painfully slow to witness. I think the country is really exasperated, actually. We've done a lot to help, in a military sense, but this humanitarian crisis and seeing people pouring out. I mean, the point about Boris Johnson, perhaps he's better to go to the border and see people pouring out of the country and what other member states are doing to help them in order that the UK can fulfil what the public really clearly want to do, which is help and house people.
We're going to hear from Ben and Mike with their views on the refugees in just a moment. It's 8:15.
LBC Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
18 minutes past 8. If you've just tuned in, we have Minette Batters with us, President of the National Farmers Union, Ben Bradshaw, former Agriculture Minister and Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, Charlotte Proudman is Human Rights Barrister at Goldsmiths Chambers, and Mike Parry, the broadcaster and commentator. Now, we were in the middle of answering a question from Steve in Southend, which was, why has the government been so slow in helping Ukrainian refugees? Ben Bradshaw.
I think this is partly that they've underestimated the generosity of the British people. I don't think they thought that the British people were as good as we are. I think there's also an element of ideology here that, the rest of Europe has lifted all visa requirements, including Ireland, which is not in Schengen. So we mustn't do that because, we don't want to be seen doing the same as the rest of Europe. And the result is that we have this incredibly complex system, which is probably going to mean that, if we get very many at all, it will be a very complex matter. And I still don't understand why we just don't lift. The security argument is completely bogus, by the way. As President Putin showed, if he wants to do dirty stuff here, he's not going to send FSB agents into the United Kingdom as refugees.
Do you not think, though,
he sends them? There are a lot easier and safer ways for him to infiltrate FSB agents into this country, as we found out in Salisbury.
But if you think that it's a completely bogus argument, then you must be accusing Priti Patel of lying over it, because I would have thought, and look, I don't know any more about it than anyone else, but I would have thought that she must have said that because she's had intelligence to that effect. She wouldn't make it up, would she? Whatever you think of it.
I don't see the intelligence, and I'm not accusing her of lying. I just think she's incompetent and she's underestimated the British people.
Mike?
Yeah, what you said about who do we favour first? We've got 37,000 asylum seekers in this country in hotels, and it's costing £5 million a day to put them into hotels. Now, I know we're a rich country, we could afford that, but I think some energy's got to come the reverse way in this issue. People like me, so I've got a couple of properties I let out, buy-to-let and all life. One comes vacant, I will offer it immediately to the government department, who can provide a, Ukrainian family to go in there and live there rent-free for a year, okay? Absolutely no problem at all. But that energy has to come from those who are willing to do it. Where do you draw the line between favouring people from the Ukraine who've gone through this horrendous experience and the 37,000 living in, travel lodge hotels in single rooms with a family of 4? When do you say to yourself, OK, it's been horrendous in Ukraine, but that's relatively recent. Some of these families have been in these hotels for 6 or 8 months.
Well, there's a simple solution to that, isn't there? You open it up to all asylum seekers, which some people would argue should have been done in the first place, maybe. Because otherwise you are discriminating, aren't you, Charlotte, between people who are already here, who will tend to have come from Middle Eastern or African countries and aren't sort of... and
probably don't have families with
I always hesitate to introduce a racial element to this, but, you can't avoid it, can you?
No, you can't avoid it, absolutely. I'm all for an open door policy. I've seen the great traumas that asylum seekers have experienced on getting to this
because
country.
surely you can't mean that you just let in everybody that wants to come here with no
what I'm saying is
checks.
that if they meet the requirements, then they should be granted refugee status. And instead we have a hostile environment where so-called, in inverted commas, genuine asylum seekers are automatically refused their claim. They have to go all the way through the immigration tribunal, which can take years, often without any legal aid, some of them having no choice but to work on the black market, earning nothing more than a couple of quid an hour if they're lucky. Some of them who have children, some who are victims of FGM, female genital mutilation, and their children at risk of that, including in Nigeria, who I represent at the moment, and other countries. And Priti Patel's just done nothing about it. We're not talking about just a one-off. We're talking about, the fact there are thousands of people in this country from other war zones and are at risk of gender-based persecution.
They are a different category of asylum seeker because a lot of them are mothers with young children. Men have stayed at home to fight in the Ukraine. So we have to really think, have we got the facilities to cater for a massive great influx of more refugees? Have we got the schools? Have we got the hospitals, which children need? Have we got the facilities to give them, the sort of life they deserve in a civilised country like ours? And I agree with Iain, when you say an open door policy, do you literally mean send boats over to, wherever we can to help these Ukrainians get out of the Ukraine and bring them to this country without any checks? I don't think we can do that. I really don't.
I don't think anyone's suggesting there shouldn't be any checks, but where there are people in need and there are displaced people, we have an obligation to make sure that they are provided for in this country. And where there's a will, which clearly there is, because British people want to provide for them, there is most certainly a way, and it's a matter of providing resources to those most in need.
Let's bring in another caller who's got an allied question to this. Steve, thank you for your question. Adam is in Bermondsey. Hello, Adam.
Hey, Ian, you kind of already was thinking what I was thinking, so I feel like the question's kind of already
that's
out
why
there.
I earn the big bucks.
Great minds think alike, obviously. So I just wanted to ask everybody, and hi everybody, well, good evening, what they thought if the newfound compassion coming from Priti Patel and the Home Office, if this scheme does work well with the Ukrainian refugees, if it should be rolled out to everybody else. Because my family actually would love to sponsor some of those black student refugees who weren't, well, newfound refugees who weren't allowed across the border, or just, any other refugee. We'd love to be able to be a sponsor and allow somebody over here. And I think it will look optically really bad if the next load of refugees who don't look blonde-haired and blue-eyed don't get the Ukrainian treatment, because they can't rescind it after just being so, they already changed it to fit the Ukrainians. So surely we have to keep it moving for the next load of refugees. And I just wanted to know if the panel thinks that Priti Patel's heart will be so warmed by this current situation that she will do an about-face and allow us to treat all refugees equally in the eyes of horrible things that may happen to people in the future.
All right, Thank you very much for that, Adam. It's an interesting precedent that's being set, Ben Bradshaw, isn't it?
Yeah, I've read somewhere in the last 48 hours that if not that the government is considering extending this to all these poor Afghans who are still living in hotels with families after several months, but I suspect if Priti Patel's heart isn't melted by the situation, Adam, the British people's response will help melt her heart. Because if it transpires that we don't get as many Ukrainians as people have applied for because it's all too complex, or they decide in the there's a quick resolution, or at least there's a frozen conflict and people can go back, then there may be more offers of accommodation by Brits than there are Ukrainians to take it. Charlotte, yes, good idea. Let's do it.
Charlotte, you probably know more about this than I do, but there was a scheme for Syrians, wasn't there? But from what I've heard, it was very bureaucratic, and it all had to be done on a community basis, and you had to raise money, buy a house, and it wasn't instant, and it hasn't actually rehoused that many people. So maybe that's a lesson that we have to learn for this scheme.
Yeah, I mean, What compassion has Priti Patel shown to Ukrainian refugees? None. I haven't seen any. Less than 10,000 people have been granted, apparently, a visa. That's it. With millions of displaced people. That's not compassion at all. It's far from it.
I think we should get into proportion, the amount of Ukrainian refugees who want to come here, because a lot of the reports I've seen on the border with Poland and all that, they don't actually want to come to Britain because, of course, their region, Poland, they have relatives, they're from the same background, that sort of thing. So I'm not sure there are hundreds of thousands who want to come here, actually. And for that reason, if you haven't got, what I'm trying to say is, if the government are aware of the fact that it's not like a massive wave of refugees wanting to come to this country, they can be more select, can't they? And get the process sorted.
I think that's a fair point, and I think a lot of people who will come here, some will want to stay permanently, but I think most, when hopefully this is all over, they will want to go back and rebuild their country. And this is where we can bring in your members, Minette, because Ukraine is a massive producer of the world's wheat, isn't it? And I don't know how much the agricultural sector will have been damaged by all of this, but presumably quite a bit. And this is something where your organisation can actually maybe assist with the rebuilding.
Well, the point you make about Ukraine, I mean, Ukraine and Russia produce 30% of global wheat exports, and they produce wheat for some of the most fragile economies in the world. And if we go back to the Arab Spring and what became actually real political challenges on the back of not enough bread. We are sleepwalking into the abyss on this because there is no global recognition of what needs to be done. We know what we're en route for. Who is going to fill that gap that Russia and Ukraine currently fill? We know that Russia is the largest exporter of fertiliser, which it stopped exporting. We know that fertiliser costs are up 200%. There are 4 billion lives dependent on nitrogen fertiliser, and nobody globally is looking at how we fill the gap. And bizarrely, Ian, actually, the COP27, the most important discussion the world will have ever had on food security, is in Egypt this November. Now, will it even happen? What will the situation be? We've got wheat prices going into a place where they have never, ever been.
What is the price of a tonne of wheat now?
You're looking at over £300 for feed wheat. So you've got costs for poultry production up 50%. You've got costs for dairy production up 50%. And the real danger that we are sleepwalking into is actually that farmers decide we're going to see double-digit contraction in production. They're just going to shore up their risk by producing less. And they're going to grow feed wheat for the market, what's not to like, rather than milling wheat for the bread market. And, you know, I am appalled, quite honestly, at the approach the government is taking right now. It isn't recognising the challenge. We have absolutely adequate food supply for the time being. 2023, we will not have it. You've already got a situation where Holland is saying, we're not exporting you any cucumbers. So this is about to really, really gear up, and the government has got to get a serious move on if it's going to avoid a disaster.
You've got a DEFRA secretary who is himself a farmer. I mean, does he not show any...
He's a horticulturist, isn't he?
Well, he is, but, I mean...
So what should he be doing, Minette? What should the government be doing to address that?
Look, there are things that they should be doing right now. We need to look at how much gas is needed across food infrastructure. We know that CO2 is an absolutely fundamental requirement from fertiliser production. We have to have CO2. So we need to look at the gas requirements. We need a core management group effectively brought together to look at what can be done, how we can intervene, and when we need to intervene to stop this crisis emerging. And at the moment, you're seeing the protected sector, that's tomatoes, cucumbers, aubergines, all of those sorts of things, peppers. You're seeing massive contraction because if you go from an average price per therm of gas to heat a glass house at 63p, a couple of weeks ago, we saw it shoot to £6 per therm. So those glasshouse productions are just having to mothball. And so George Eustace needs to be pulling that group together. But this goes much wider than just George Eustace. There has to be an absolute focus on food security here. It has to be seen as a national priority. And globally, the UK should be leading this discussion. The G7 summit was called in Germany. We've heard very little since then. All we've been hearing is, well, we're a wealthy nation. We're not reliant on Ukraine. Who is going to fill that gap? And we already know that Ukraine has a cropping area the size of Italy. When I spoke to my opposite numbers over there the other day, they reckon at very best 50% will be planted and more likely 30%. Everybody has gone off to fight. They've got nobody to do the harvest, and their government has said to them, you're not exporting anyway.
See, this is frightening stuff. You've been in government. You know how sometimes government can be a bit slow to react. But if you were Secretary of State in that department now, wouldn't you be having almost a sort of permanent war cabinet meeting every morning and really gripping this crisis? Because if Minette is right, this time next year, we're all going to rather regret the fact that they haven't.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Minette's just said is extremely interesting and quite scary. And I think it's a very good example, and there are probably lots of others, of where when you're in the middle of a crisis or a crisis has just started, as well as dealing with the immediate crisis, you need to have some medium and long-term thinking, and you need to have structures within government to do that. Now, when I was in government, you know, if COBRA was meeting on a regular basis, I don't know whether it is under this Prime Minister, then the DEFRA Secretary should be asking for this to be put on the agenda. So this is discussed among all the senior ministers, and from that discussion, the civil servants go away and do something about it. I don't know how well that's functioning at the moment. I mean, judging by the competence of this Prime Minister so far, I don't have an awful lot of confidence. But that's what should be happening. And we should be looking not just at how we deal with the immediate crisis, but what's going to happen in 6 months' time, 12 months' time, 18 months' time.
Just to play devil's advocate on that point, whatever was got wrong in COVID, they did get the vaccine programme rollout right, and that was done within government. I mean, it was rolled out by the NHS, but they were given the resources to do it. So you would hope that this is the sort of thing that they would get a grip of sooner rather than later. But if in a year's time I'm spending all my time talking about food shortages, I shall remember this conversation.
Shouldn't we, just as we did with the vaccine, shouldn't we bring in the private sector to try and organise the things that Minette says needs doing? I mean, do we have enough fields in this country, Minette, to double our wheat capacity, the growing wheat here in our country? And if so, then doesn't it need somebody like Lord Sugar, or somebody like Mr. Dyson, who makes vacuum cleaners very successfully, or somebody who knows how to organise a very big operation,
or someone like Minette.
Or somebody like Minette. Somebody like Minette would be perfect.
Between Minette and Kate Bingham.
You could be the new Kate Bingham.
Exactly. And we could have the slogan.
I can hear Dame Minette.
That's right, Dame Minette
or Baroness.
You heard it here first.
Anyway,
for Britain.
Right, we have to go to the news. Some really good answers there, and I think we should all reflect on what Minette has been saying. 0345 6060 973. News time on LBC. It's 8:33. Here's Zora Suleiman.
Ukraine's defence minister has accused Russia of committing genocide in his country. A 35-hour curfew has come into force in the capital Kyiv after 8 people were killed in an attack on a shopping centre. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe has criticised the UK government for taking 6 years to secure her release from being detained in Tehran. The British-Iranian charity worker has spoken publicly for the first time since returning to Britain. And pubs are going to be allowed to stay open later to celebrate the Queen's Platinum Jubilee weekend. Licensing rules will be relaxed for 3 nights in June. LBC weather: a dry night for most areas across the UK, lows of freezing.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:37, Minette Batters, Ben Bradshaw, Charlotte Proudman and Mike Parry here answering your questions. Sean in Dover has sent this text in. How on earth did we get to a situation where London became Londongrad and a safe haven for dirty Russian money? How much do we really know about the influence this money is having? Now, Ben, you were one of the first British politicians to raise concerns about Russian interference in the UK's democratic processes. Did you realise at that point the extent of the Russian money that was in London?
No, and I don't think we still do. And we're in a better place than we were. But it's extremely disappointing that it's taken this awful war for this government, indeed any government, to get real about this. I mean, this started under our government after the global financial crash. We wanted people to invest in the UK. We introduced this golden visa scheme. We still don't know who's paid for golden visas and who they are and why and where their properties are. The scale of it.
Why was that introduced?
Well, I think it was just introduced because, we like the whole of the global economy, were affected by the global financial crash, and we wanted people to carry on investing in the UK. And don't forget, back then, when Putin first came on the scene after Yeltsin, there were hopes that he was going to reset his relationship with the West. So, to start with, we were working with him. But if you've listened to Jonathan Powell, Tony Blair's chief of staff, has done numerous interviews on this, that very quickly changed. And I think we should have woken up to this much sooner. I mean, as you say, I was the first MP to raise this in the House of Commons. I was treated as a sort of tin foil brigade person by Tory MPs and Conservative commentators for even suggesting that this was corrupting our politics. It gives me no comfort to say that people are now taking this seriously, but we've still got a long way to go, and there are still loopholes in the legislation the government passed last week. But until it's not just Russian money, by the way. I mean, the money London is a centre for money laundering throughout the country. The role of the overseas territories is very significant in this. We still haven't done enough to close those down, but and also the influence of money going into political parties. And people talk about Boris Johnson being out of the woods on Partygate. He's not out of the woods on Russian money. He's up to his necks in Russian money, and I think this is going to come back to haunt him.
What do you mean up to his neck?
Well, the Tory party have taken £9 million from oligarchs close to the Kremlin, and I think you will see in the next few weeks and months a lot of the stories that I've been aware of for a number of years that were around.
Do you differentiate between the oligarchs who you say are close to the Kremlin? They have to be British citizens to donate money to a political party, but there are some of them who are very, very anti-Putin, aren't they? I mean, do you lump them all together, or do you think that all of them should not be donating money?
They say they're anti-Putin, but what would you say if you were an FSB asset? Would you say you were pro-Putin? Of course you wouldn't. I mean, come on. I mean, the fact that the security services raised concerns about Lebedev peerage, and these were not only ignored by the Prime Minister, but overridden by the Prime Minister. And yes, Lebedev can say that he abhors what Putin's doing in Moscow, but he would say that, wouldn't he? And what choice has he got? So I think we've been far too complacent, far too innocent, and far too greedy. And that goes, for law firms, for PR firms, all of these people who've made a lot of money, taking journalist Catherine Belton, who wrote the definitive piece about the role of the oligarchs in corrupting our democracy, almost lost her case in court, aided and abetted by very wealthy London law firms and PR firms. And we've got to make sure that we never allow ourselves to be in the position again. And, it's not even talking about China. We haven't even started thinking about China and what they're doing.
Well, just on Lebedev, there's a brilliant podcast from Tortoise Media called Slow News.
Yes,
have you listened to that?
Excellent.
I mean, it is a really good listen if anyone wants to have a listen to that, preferably after the end of this programme. Minette.
We've got to do every single thing to marginalise, to cut off this regime. And I'm really pleased to see what has been done. But my goodness, do we have to keep the pressure on? And
we're playing catch-up, aren't we, basically? Yeah.
We are playing massive catch-up. And when I look how reliant, sorry to go back to the whole situation of food security again, but when I look how reliant the world has become on Russia, how reliant Europe has become on Russian gas, it's an absolute catastrophe that we've allowed that to happen. We can avert avert that danger, but we need to act very, very swiftly.
Mike.
Yeah, I think we're now seeing the extent to which Russia has always been a gangster state. I mean, that's an expression that's, passed around. But when Chelsea was bought by Mr. Abramovich, we just thought he was a rich Russian who wanted a football club. But of course it wasn't that, was it? It was the start of whitewashing the money, getting the money out of Russia. Nobody ever asked, excuse me, why are all these oligarchs putting their money overseas? The answer is, if it was in a bank in Russia, it would get stolen. Somebody would steal it. It's a corrupt gangster state. Now, we should actually take it as a compliment that when the Russians got very, very filthy rich by stealing the money from their people, they wanted to come to London because we are a very safe and secure society. Nothing was going to go wrong. Nobody's going to steal it from the banks in London. And we have, the world centre to all intents and purposes in the City of London. It's a very good place to bring your money and make sure it's safe for the rest of the time. We turn blind eyes because, as Ben and Minette has said, estate agents in this country suddenly aren't going to turn down a guy who wants to buy a house worth 150 million quid because the money they get from that alone is 10%. They get 15 million for selling a 150 million pound mansion. Now, you mentioned greed as well, Ben. Greed is within all of us, but when the huge amounts of money was coming here, and you quite rightly say, now being funneled off to the Virgin Islands, or the Bahamas or somewhere like that, nobody in business was going to turn that money down because at the start, it wasn't seen to be as filthy, dirty lucre as it clearly is now.
Charlotte.
Well, I think we should be turning down Russian oligarchs that want to buy lavish, opulent homes when they're colluding with Putin.
Can you assure me that your chambers doesn't act for any Russian oligarchs
not
anybody like that? Because I know plenty of law firms in London that do.
All I can say is not to my knowledge. We're a human rights set and we're proud of that. But I ask you...
Not to my knowledge, eh?
I can't speak for the rest of the 100 members of which, exist in chambers, but I certainly wouldn't touch a case like that with a barge pole. But unexplained wealth orders, how many of those orders have actually been made? Two, which means, assets, other property which can't be explained in terms of how it's being paid for is confiscated without having to prove criminality. And two, that shows how unenforceable the law is and how ineffective it is. So it's not really sending out a very strong symbolic message, is it?
Law enforcement authorities have decided that that's not a priority for them.
Or that they don't have the resources.
Or they don't have the resources.
They should be prioritising it then.
And the NCA, who did the one unexplained wealth order, or the one of the two, I mean, they faced a battalion of the highest paid law firms in London acting on behalf of the people.
But not Charlotte's.
But not your...
Sadly, not that
human
legal aid doesn't pay, I'm afraid. But I remember seeing that case.
And
in
you
court.
earn 20 or 30 times more working for a bank or a private sector organisation on compliance than you do working for a national public agency. And that whole funding thing, as well as the legal framework's got to be.
You're in the wrong job. You need to move to.
I'm on the side of angels, Ian.
Aren't we all?
Apart from when I'm on LBC.
Yeah. By the way, on the Russian thing, does everybody know what's going to happen to all these oligarch super yachts? Because they're floating around the world now.
People are obsessed by yachts, aren't they?
It's because they're worth hundreds of millions.
Are the Saudis or the Middle East and the oligarchs, and all the oligarchs are giving theirs up now. And these yachts are worth like 100 million quid. What's happened to them?
Our government got criticised for not seizing yachts. I'm thinking, yeah, but how many of them are moored in the UK waters? I suspect very few.
No, they're not.
Where are they going to put them?
Anyway,
Exactly.
we will move on to something else in just a moment. Do stay with us. It's 8:46 on LBC.
LBC. Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Weekday mornings from 7.
Health Secretary Sajid Javid. Were you PM, would you go to Kyiv? Or, as Health Secretary and one of his close colleagues, would you urge he does go to Kyiv?
I struggle to see how he could provide even more support than we're currently doing, where it's military, it's humanitarian. The UK is doing more than almost
Doesn't it
any
send a heck
other
of a
country.
message, though, doesn't it? For the British PM to be seen in Kyiv, presumably shaking hands with or his arm around the Ukrainian president, that's a message for Putin, isn't it?
It's not a good idea to talk about the Prime Minister's future travel plans.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It's 10 to 9 on LBC. Minette Batters, Ben Bradshaw, Charlotte Proudman and Mike Parry with us taking your calls. Let's go to Martin in Doncaster. Hello, Martin.
Hi, Iain and panel. Yeah, in October, my gas bottles were £38. They are now £77. How am I supposed to eat my home and cook when I don't qualify for any of the £350 targeted support?
Charlotte.
Well, the truth is, Martin, you're not. You know, you have to make a choice whether you heat your home or whether you cook. That's the reality of it, I imagine, and not just for you, for many other people across the country, where people are having to choose exactly that. Do I eat? Do I heat my home? Do I eat? Or do my children eat? These are the kind of questions that people are facing now. I think it's going to be probably one of the biggest crises confronting the British public, and I think it's only going to get worse as we move into a spring, summer of discontent, because it's not just rising fuel prices, it's increased inflation, coupled with the national insurance hike, coupled with the fact that the universal credit was cut and that hasn't been overturned. And people are in dire poverty with rising food prices and people using food banks. I see this firsthand with many of my clients on legal aid who are struggling to make ends meet. And these are mothers with children. And one of the other factors I think we also need to consider is that many people, unfortunately, are in abusive relationships. And one of the greatest single factors for why women and some men are not able to escape abusive relationships is because of economic and financial control and poverty. And this is only going to exacerbate that.
I think also every household now, and I don't mean just people in situations like Martin, I think people on sort of good wages are now going to have to look at their budgeting in a way that they just haven't done in the future. I mean, even sort of us around this table, whom people think we're probably all very rich, apart from Charlotte, who's on legal aid, obviously. I mean, I found myself doing this. Do we buy that, or do we go without now?
I totally agree. The answer to Martin is the whole economy is going to be rebooted, and we are going to live as less prosperous people in the next couple of years than we have in the past decade, because we're all going to have to readjust. So, for instance, Martin's gas bill means, if it's doubled like that, the once-a-week visit to the local Chinese restaurant is no longer on. That means the restaurant's eventually going to close down.
Sky Sports, gone.
Yeah, absolutely. People might have to do that. I mean, look, how many subscription services you got in your house? You got Netflix and all that. People are definitely going to start knocking those off, because if you're only watching a couple of programmes a month or something like that, and you buy it for the Beatles on Disney or something like that, you're going to scrap it again. All our standards of living are going to go down, and it's all down to the fact, in my view, my humble view, we gave in to the Green lobby far too easily, without any long-term thinking about what happens if. And the what happens if has happened, and we're now unable to defend ourselves and provide energy that we need in this country to run the UK.
I think everybody continues to be grateful that LBC is free to air and will remain so. Ben Bradshaw.
I mean, Martin's question was, how is he supposed to cope? And I suppose the honest answer to that is with great difficulty. Let's see what Rishi Sunak comes up with on Wednesday. I don't have particularly high hopes. I mean, there's talk he might cut a bit off petrol at the pumps, which would be welcome. He might do a bit on the threshold for paying national insurance. We think on the Labour side that he should scrap the national insurance increase completely, and that he should introduce, as most other European countries have, a windfall tax on the record profits of the oil and gas companies. Because of the price of oil and gas, they are making record profits. They're not reinvesting that, as the government's arguing that they should. They're giving it back in dividends to their shareholders and in bonuses to their directors. And if we do that, we can give every consumer, including Martin, £600 off their bills. That's what Rishi should be doing on Wednesday, and I hope he does it.
Well, Martin, you might want to phone in at 7 o'clock on Wednesday, because we'll have the Chancellor Rishi Sunak live in the studio for 45 minutes taking your calls. I think it's the first time that a Chancellor has ever done that after a budget statement. So do tune in for that.
Take his number.
Yeah, we will. Minette Batters.
Well, Martin, I think you just highlight the sort of perfect storm that everybody faces on many different aspects of how we live our lives. And this is why my focus with government is saying we have got to come together. We have got to work as a whole chain with government, making sure that we manage the situation with food availability, making sure that food production is prioritised as a real serious national issue of security, and look at where we need to intervene and when we need to intervene. And I think at the moment I see this government as effectively free market is code for actually I'm just going to not do anything. And when I look at what the US is doing and the intervention that the US is doing, I mean, they are really making sure that they are managing what is going on with production out there. We are not prioritising production of food here at all. There's a real danger that if we don't act, we are not going to have enough liquid milk here. We are not going to have enough milling wheat to make bread. Prices are going to rise. There's a perfect way around that. There is a way to manage it. We have the climate to do it, Martin, but it really does need serious action. I'll be intrigued to see what the Chancellor outlines, but do not leave food out of this debate, because we want to make sure that you have high quality British food and we want to make sure it's affordable. But that is not going to happen unless we work collectively, all of us together.
Martin, thank you. Let's move on to Shahid in Hemel Hempstead. Shahid, you've got a question which I guess is more directed at Ben, but we'll get brief contributions from our other three panellists as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, with Ben Bradshaw standing down at the next election, and with Labour now having less than half the MPs than they did in 1997 and 2001, I was wondering, what do the panel think are the reasons that Labour lost so many of its supporters? Why the reason they only have 200-odd MPs when in 1997 they had over 400? And what kind of policies will get the supporters back? Do they even want the supporters back? Are they more interested in Conservative voters coming over to Labour?
Well, there's a lot in that, but
So,
you're standing down just as Labour look to be on their way back.
Well, that's one of the reasons I'm standing down, because I feel a bit more relaxed about doing it. I would have been worried standing down under Jeremy Corbyn, because he might have parachuted some nutter into my seat, as he did in a number of other seats. No, Shahid, the quick answer to your question is we were too left wing, and you may not agree with that, but the truth about politics in this country is you win elections from the centre. Tony Blair did it 3 times, record election wins. The other successful Labour Prime Ministers have done that. The public didn't trust our leader, and they didn't trust us on the economy. Keir's bringing that back, he's winning that back, he's doing a good job. I'm more optimistic than I have been since 2008 about Labour's prospects, but it's not very complicated, this. I've been in this business all my life, and if you go too far to either extreme, the British voters don't like it, and that's what we did, and we were punished for it, and we're living with the consequences, unfortunately, which is Boris Johnson.
Charlotte.
I mean, goodness, where to start with that? It's a big question. I mean, I supported Jeremy Corbyn's policies. I thought that he, as a leader, was very problematic. I think particularly concerning, obviously, the anti-Semitism issue, which understandably caused a huge divide within Jewish communities. And I think
security.
Absolutely, security.
Defense.
Rise of anti-Semitism as well. But in terms of the policies, I mean, given that I represent often some of those marginalised people, he was actually putting out solid policies there which would have made their lives better. And unfortunately, the British people, they didn't agree. So what do you do to win it back? I think Ben's probably right. I think, you can have an ideological view, but in practice, how do you win a general election? It probably is moving to the centre.
Mike Parry, what advice would you like to offer the Labour Party?
Well, I don't really have any advice for the Labour Party. Where I think it all changed was that I'm from the north of England. I'm from Chester, very proud of it. And I think people in the north of England have got more common sense than people in metropolitan elite North London, Islington. And I think they saw through the fact that the Labour Party was being run. The last 3 leaders of the Labour Party have all lived in Islington, haven't they? In North London, I think. And that says it all to me. And the people of the north of England swung the last election, the Red Wall.
was in Kentish Town. Apparently that's not Islington.
Well, it's certainly North London, metropolitan elite, in my view.
I don't think you can put Tony Blair, Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer all in the same bracket. They were very different politicians.
Yeah, but they all lived there, if you see what I mean, Ben. And there are people in the north of England who saw through all this.
They represented seats all over. Tony Tony Blair represented Durham. He wasn't from London originally. So, I mean, you know, we live in a very centralised political economy, as you know. I mean, you live in London, I assume. Iain lives in London. Unfortunately,
I'm
people
disgusted at
gravitate
Tunbridge Wells
towards London, but I don't think it makes you incapable of being able to be a successful politician and represent the country. But I take your point. I mean, I think Chester still has a very good Labour MP, but I completely agree with you about the common sense of the people in the north, and we should have listened to them more closely.
Now, Minette, do you want to plead the fifth on this one, because we're getting towards the end of the programme, and I'd quite like to do a text at the end. But if you want to have a short answer on this, feel free.
Short answer coming. Look, I think the last Labour administration did not. 70% of the UK is rural, and if Labour wants to be successful, they have to have really clear, cohesive policies for rural areas. They have to prioritise food production, take it seriously. They have done in the past, and I'm sure they stand every success. That failed last time. It cannot fail again. The time is pressing.
Our final fun text of the night. Emma in Northampton says, pubs will be allowed to stay open later to celebrate the Platinum Jubilee. Which pub will you be making the most of the extra time in? Hope it's my pub, the Lamplighter. I wonder if that text has anything to do with the fact that my producer comes from Northampton. Ben Bradshaw, what will you be doing for the Platinum Jubilee?
I plan to go away. It's the long weekend we're getting, isn't it?
It is, 4 days.
I'm scarfering. I'm making the most of it and getting out of the country.
Well, that's not very patriotic.
Well, I'm sorry.
Given it's the Platinum Jubilee.
I have to take these opportunities when I can.
Minette?
I'll be supporting my local economy of Salisbury.
What's your favourite pub in Salisbury?
There are many. I'm not going to prioritise one on here, that's for sure.
It's a cop-out, I'm afraid.
I'll visit them all, Ian.
Mike?
Well, I want to do something that actually celebrates the reign of the Queen for the 70 years, and I don't know yet how to, but what I'm saying is I will not be seeking, for myself to enjoy that. I want to do something which actually contributes to celebrating the Queen's great reign, and by that I mean I want to do something charitable or something like that.
Weatherspoons evening.
Well, there won't be a bit of Weatherspoons over that weekend.
Favourite pub. Charlotte, come on, rescue us.
Yeah.
Oh, God. So I don't want to rain on the Queen's Parade. Ha.
Here we go.
But I'm not a monarchist, I'm afraid, so I most definitely won't be celebrating.
It's in the spring half-term, which is very unfortunate for families who are planning a bit of a holiday.
Well, I should be going to the Gunton Arms if I can get a table, because it's a sort of pub restaurant, but 6-week waiting time they seem to have at the moment.
If you can still afford it.
Well, that's another reason for going abroad.
That's very true. Norfolk is abroad. Right, thank you very much indeed. Ben, Minette, Charlotte and Mike. We'll have another one for you tomorrow. It's 9:02. In a moment, we're going to be talking about your experience of loan sharks, because there's some research out today that shows that 70% of people who've had to go to loan sharks have considered taking their own lives. It's 9:02.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, a 35-hour curfew has come into force in Kyiv following a surge in attacks on Ukraine's capital. Authorities say 8 people were killed in the Russian bombardment of a shopping centre last night. Meantime, the chairman of the Conservative Party has defended comments